The Vietnam War, Propaganda and its Effects. The Vietnam War was a very impactful event, both in its political impacts and warfare implications. In a sense, it was an omen of what was to come in modern warfare. Although opinions differ on the war, many people agree that the US lost, which begs the question, why?
The Cold War period, 1947 to 1991, was a time of international fear and animosity, particularly towards any left-leaning countries. The United States went to war with Vietnam because of North Vietnam's communist leanings and lost due to the popularity of the revolution and the subsequent support for the insurgency. The US and the South Vietnamese tried to sway the public's opinion with different forms of propaganda to gain support among Vietnamese people. Both the US and the Viet Cong tried many avenues of communication to spread their propaganda. The Viet Cong's propaganda was way more successful because they appealed to the needs of the nation's past, and against the US actions during the war.
Today we're going to be exploring why North Vietnamese propaganda was more effective than anything that the US tried during the war. However, we first have to understand what led up to the war to understand the rhetoric bolstered by both sides.
100 years ago, Europe was the epicenter of world power. Most notable among these great powers was Britain. There is a great quote that I'm sure you've all heard before, written by John Wilson: "The sun never sets on the British Empire." The reason the sun never set on the British Empire was because of their mastery of imperialism, which is the prime way powers throughout history have made gains, from the Romans to the Ottomans to the British. In the 20th century, imperialism was justified with social Darwinism and race theory. Social Darwinism reasons that survival of the fittest plays out in society as well as nature. And since Europe was the first one to develop quote-unquote society, they were superior. By some reasoning, the Europeans thought they were doing a favor to these places by bringing culture and the advancements of quote civilized end quote society. Rudyard Kipling, an English journalist, called this the white man's burden. Europe fell off because of the world wars. It's generally accepted that World War I started because of a web of alliances. When one attacked another, it spiraled out of control. The First World War was a dark omen for Europe, and its peace agreement was seen as unstable. As Ferdinand Foch put it, "This is not a peace. This is an armistice for 20 years, a chillingly accurate prediction." With the Second World War, Europe was in shambles. Its landscapes were badly damaged at home, affecting the worldwide economies. Due to this, the colonies started to unwind. The US even sometimes worked with indigenous resistance movements. For example, in the war against Japan, who had seized French Indochina, the OSS worked with guerrillas advocating for independence. With the decline of Europe, the Great Western Power was now the US, who came out the least economically damaged from World War II. FDR was fiercely anti-colonial, and one of the Atlantic Charter's calls for self-determination to apply to all liberated areas. The subcontinent of India was the first to go. The collapse of the colonies created new nations that were unstable because their borders were drawn by foreigners. These new nations were suddenly caught up in the Cold War. With the collapse of Europe, the two major powers that remained were the Soviet Union and the United States. They were bound to start competing after the war because they were simply the two major powers left in the world. It didn't help matters that the two's ideologies were diametrically opposed. The Soviet Union was a socialist country and gave pretty much all control to the government, who strictly regulated actions with a secret police. The US, on the other hand, was a fiercely capitalist nation with checks and balances on the government, with many more personal freedoms. Even before the Second World War ended, the two were maneuvering in a race to Berlin. Some communist spies were even implanted in the top-secret Manhattan Project, which was the development of the first nuclear weapon. This set the tone for a period of intense competition on the world stage. The US developed a theory on communist expansion called the domino theory. This theory was partially true. The European Soviet bloc, or the Iron Curtain as Churchill called it, was a group of nations in Europe that had fallen under Soviet control during the Second World War. The Soviets had set up allied socialist puppet governments in those places. The new nations were free from colonialism would see their genuine political movements, whether socialist or right-wing, be swept up and used as proxies for these two powers as they clashed for power and influence on the world stage, never engaging directly due to the threat of all-out nuclear war, instead engaging in drawn-out proxy wars that threw the newly freed Third World into chaos. As British espionage officer John Le Carre put it, the Cold War provided the perfect excuse for Western governments to plunder and exploit the Third World in the name of freedom, to rig its elections, bribe its politicians, appoint tyrants, and by every sophisticated means of persuasion and interference, stun the emergence of young democracies in the name of democracy. Vietnam was no exemption to this broad trend on the world stage.
Vietnam is a former French colony turned communist by a self-determination movement within the country. We'll be exploring Vietnam's context through the eyes of a key player named Ho Chi Minh, who played a major role in starting the revolution. Ho grew up in the upper class of Vietnam. As a result, Ho attended a French boarding school in Hue called the National Academy. Ho's education at a French school made him bilingual and able to express his thoughts in a well-regimented and persuasive manner. Ho joined the movement for self-determination in his days at the National Academy. After finishing his studies in 1911, Ho took up a job as a waiter on a boat and traveled around the world as a result. He is said to have lived in New York for a short time, when his ship sailed there in 1912. This journey shocked him. Immigrants in the U.S. had the right to vote when they became citizens, a right that the Vietnamese people had been denied. Sometime in 1914, Ho traveled to England, where he started to join anti-colonial circles made up of ex-colonial subjects of Europe.
Ho moved to Paris in 1917 and started to write for an anti-colonial newspaper, which got him kicked out of the colony of Vietnam. Ho even attended the Treaty of Versailles to lobby for fair treatment of colonial subjects. This failed. However, this changed in 1920 when he helped found the Communist Party of France and traveled to Moscow in 1923 and met with Bolshevik officials. It is here that he became a Soviet agent for revolution in Vietnam and was sent to China in 1924 to start laying the groundwork for the revolution. From here, it is extremely hard to say where he went and with whom he met. Some people think that he met with Mao, which I am inclined to believe because that's where he may have gotten some of his guerrilla warfare expertise, which Mao was an expert at. During the Second World War, he emerged from his exile and led his people in a revolt against the occupying Japanese forces. Ho was described as, quote, an awfully sweet guy, end quote, by the OSS, the precursor to the CIA.
After the Second World War, Ho Chi Minh declared the former colony independent and set up a government. In the official post-war agreement, the French and the British would occupy Vietnam up to the 16th parallel, and anything above would be given to China, who allowed Ho to rule. The French began a fierce counterinsurgency to quell the cries for revolution, and eventually ventured past the 16th parallel. This started an all-out war in 1964. Over the next 8 years, the insurgency continued under the leadership of Ho. At the Geneva Convention, the issue was settled. The 17th parallel was to be the new border between South and North Vietnam, with reunification elections being held 2 years from the agreement. The South Vietnamese government failed to hold reunification elections for the fear that Ho would have won. With this, the Viet Cong were set up in the South, a movement supported by the North's vast resources and allies. The stage was set for an intervention by the U.S.
Part 3. North Vietnamese Propaganda.
Simply put, propaganda is a form of media that shifts public opinion in a political discussion.
This photo is a book cover. The first thing that is noticeable is the depiction of Vietnamese fighters. This symbolizes the fight for freedom throughout Vietnam's history. Many Vietnamese citizens were probably alive to see both wars. The image of their soldiers played on the pride of the past by depicting the warriors as continuing the struggle of previous generations. Another key piece of this art is the depiction of modernization, innovation in agriculture, and factories which benefited Vietnam. By promising this in the artwork, they offered a good incentive for supporting the revolution. The last notable art on the cover is the depiction of Ho with Lenin. This is impactful for a communist Vietnamese because Lenin was a key figure in establishing communism.
An interesting aspect of the Vietnam War is that it was one of the first ever battles shown on live TV. One of the most horrid and well-known photos is of Kik Tuang Dong, a Vietnamese monk who set himself on fire in protest of South Vietnam's persecution of Buddhist monks. Many have actually seen this photo before in Rage Against the Machine's self-titled album, who are known for their song Killing in the Name of. Showing the horrors of war on TV massively influenced the US populace perception, and according to an article entitled Vietnam, the Television War, Americans were starting to watch more TV during the era of when the Vietnam War started. According to Peter Baystrup, the Director of Communications for the Library of Congress, says that this gave the American public a very biased and incorrect view on the war. Another point that reinforces this is a document recovered by Vietnamese soldiers. This document states that the communists plan to spread negative media, like the aforementioned photos, about the US in the press. South Vietnam and the US tried to highlight the positive aspects of war, encouraging patriotism and advocating against the policies of the North. And for those in the South, in their propaganda, they failed because, firstly, the US was largely seen as imperialist by most Vietnamese people and US citizens. They were defending the government who denied their people self-determination. The US's actions during the war didn't help either. This also makes it hard to push patriotism with a population that was divided and refused reunification by the very government that is now asking them to be patriotic. We would like to thank two major sources that helped this project immensely. The first is the biographic show on Ho Chi Minh. They provided vital information on Ho Chi Minh in their video, and it will be linked below. The second is a website called SciWarrior.com, which has a large collection of propaganda. We used the Vietnam section to find out much of the propaganda shown in the video. Thanks for watching.